Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. So, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining Dr. Stephen Nagy and me, Maya Matsuoka, in this room, which is on the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. And today we're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Central and Eastern Europe. So, for some reason, it looks like the countries in Central and Eastern Europe are not so engaged with the Indo-Pacific region, but maybe there is something different, or things are different. So I'm looking forward to what Stephen has to tell us tonight. So without any further ado, Stephen, let's open the room. And as always, after you finish, I'll invite people who want to share observations and have comments or questions to join up to join us on stage. So that's it. Let's go.
Thanks very much, Maya. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight. And my apologies for the postponement last week. I just had another event on, which was a bit of a different overlapping. So, I think it's a good place to start today's discussion is to go over what the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific vision is, whether we're talking about the EU vision, the German guidelines, the Dutch strategy, the American strategy, or the Japanese strategy. One of the core principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific is this idea of a rules-based order. And this rules-based order is definitely not calcified. That means it's open to negotiation, but the rules need to be negotiated or changed through consensus-based discussions, finding ways to build a common view about what is the rule, how should the rules change, how shouldn't the rules change. And up to now, what we've seen is that countries have, by and large, agreed to change a lot of rules. And if we think about the Paris Climate Accords, this is a very good example of many countries coming together to negotiate the rules about how we deal with climate change. If we think about financial policies and how we deal with fraud or how we deal with terrorism. This is another example where many countries came together to negotiate the outcomes or the shared way of dealing with terrorism or fraud cases in our financial system. So we already have a track record of countries coming together, whether they are democracies or whether they're authoritarian regimes, coming together to negotiate these important areas. So when I think about the free and open Indo-Pacific, first and foremost, it's this idea of a rules-based order, transparency, as well as this idea that how we negotiate foreign affairs is through a rules-based order. So and one of the reasons why countries have come up with this idea is they're concerned about countries changing the so-called rules-based order through force, as we've seen in Russia and Ukraine, through gray zone tactics that we've seen in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and perhaps you could probably say this in the Himalayan Plateau, or through lawfare tactics where countries slice away at the legal justification for sovereignty by other countries. In this sense, the focus on a rules-based order by many countries within the Indo-Pacific region is really to push back and stop Machiavellian approaches to changing regional order or changing how we understand security architecture or changing how we understand trade or dealing with other issues that matter to the region. So in this sense, and I think this is a really good place for us to start about why the European Union, Central Europe and Eastern Europe should be thinking about the Indo-Pacific, in particular the core principle of preserving a rules-based order, because quite frankly, right now on their eastern front, we have Russia violating the sovereignty of the Ukraine. It's a clear violation of UN and international law. It's a clear example of using force to try to change the regional order. And what we see is that clear use of force to try to change the regional order has not just affected Ukraine. By last count, 14 million Ukrainians have left the country. 2 to 3 million are in Poland. Some have transferred to France, Germany, Hungary, and other countries. We have economic dislocation within the region. We have disruption in supply chains, in particular food and grain supply chains from both Ukraine and Russia. We also have now an energy crisis or energy security challenges because one country tried to change the rules-based order. So in a sense, Central Europe and Eastern Europe, however we define those, and we can talk about these, have an interest in preserving the order because these principles that apply to the Indo-Pacific region also apply to Eastern and Central Europe. And right now they are being challenged by Russia, who is trying to revise or break or reform the eastern flank of the European Union through force. So I think that is really critical and probably the most important part of today's discussion. But another part that I think is important for us to be really focusing on is also thinking about what kinds of opportunities exist in the Indo-Pacific region at large and what kinds of risks or challenges that exist within the region at large. So in terms of opportunity, I think most analysts recognize the Indo-Pacific region as the central core, the area that has the most economic dynamism, and this will be the center of the global economy moving forward, and that if Central and Eastern European countries want to continue to develop their economies, they're going to need to reach out to that region, both as a consumer, but potentially as a partner for consuming their other form of partner in other areas. So trade and economy is a simple way to be thinking about this. And as Central and Eastern Europe are thinking about redefining their relations with the European Union, one important area is to seek out new economic partners. And of course, the Indo-Pacific region has a plethora of economic partners, from India to Southeast Asia to Korea to China to Japan, as well as others. So it represents a real economic opportunity. What we're also going to see moving forward in the Indo-Pacific broadly, from the eastern part of Africa all the way to the Pacific, is we're going to see many challenges emerge. And those challenges could be refugee challenges, could be climate change challenges, could be piracy, illegal fishing, and challenges to sea lines of communication. And here again, Europeans, whether they're Western, Central, or Eastern Europeans, are also susceptible to disruptions in supply chains, disruptions in sea lines of communication, and as a result, they should be looking to this region to try and stabilize their governance, as well as ensuring that those sea lines of communication remain stable, prosperous, and governed by a common set of rules. So this is another, I think, really critical aspect of thinking about the region, is how the region can be disrupted, and a disruption in that region can affect supply chains, sea lines of communication, trade. But there's also that non-traditional security side of, what happens in this region could affect the economies and it could affect stability in Central and Eastern Europe by the disruption of supply chains, etc. And lastly, and I'm going to try and limit my comments today so we can have more conversation, is to be thinking about the region's geopolitical challenges. Whether we are thinking about proliferation of mass destruction on the Korean Peninsula, and our friend in Pyongyang is talking about a nuclear test in the coming month, or we're talking about territorial disputes between Japan and Korea, or Japan and China. These represent potential flashpoints for destabilizing stable sea lines of communication. The Taiwan Strait also represents really perhaps the most the area with the most potential for disruption. And when we saw the exercises in and around Taiwan at the beginning of August, many were looking at these as a prelude to some kind of forced reunification with Taiwan, and trying to understand how they would affect supply chains, both from the standpoint of common good supply chains, but also technology. So this region has, again, opportunity in terms of trade, economy, institution forming, challenges associated with climate change and other non-traditional security issues. But we also have security issues that if something happens in this particular region, something similar to what we've seen with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, that this would fundamentally destabilize the region, destabilize the regional economy, but would have really downstream effects on Central and Eastern European countries. So with that, the Indo-Pacific framework, or the Indo-Pacific itself, is important for Central and Eastern European countries from the standpoint of preserving rule of law and ensuring that rule of law is how we negotiate and engage in international affairs with other countries. That they seize the economic opportunities within the region to try and redefine their identity within the European context and create more economic diversity and trade diversity so that they are better positioned to negotiate the challenges of being within the European Union. But they also need to think about the challenges that do exist within the Indo-Pacific region and how they, without keeping their eye on those areas without finding ways to contribute and bring stability to the region. And that what happens in this region could spill over to Central and Eastern Europe, making it more difficult for them to deal with their own security challenges, their economic challenges and development, but of course negotiating their positions within the European Union so that they're not seen as junior members of the European Union, rather they're seen as equal members of the European Union. So I'll stop there. That's some food for thought, and I'd love to hear some ideas from other people.
Thank you, Stephen. And yes, everybody, who is willing to come up on stage and join us, please do. Well, Stephen, yes, you said that the Indo-Pacific is important for the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but do they have well-defined, let's say, Indo-Pacific strategy? Because you talked in previous rooms, you talked about the Indo-Pacific strategy of Germany, as you said, and other, well, let's say France and the Netherlands, the United States, Canada, but is there anything that has been defined in Central Europe and Eastern Europe with regards to the Indo-Pacific?
Not really, and I think that it somewhat depends on which country you go to. So in Poland, they seem to have a strong research group that's looking at the Indo-Pacific at the University of Warsaw, and they put together actually a teaching manual of how to teach about the Indo-Pacific region and what it means for Europe, which has been really interesting. They look at it from the viewpoint of non-traditional security issues like piracy, climate change, migration, transnational diseases, to hard security issues, to trade and economy. They also put together a couple volumes looking at comparative ideas of the Indo-Pacific. So they're looking at it, but from the government's point of view, the Polish, at least, are looking at how not through for them this isn't a choice between the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. They want to know how to use both of these for their interests. Hungary as well, they're in a position where they would like to diversify their position away from Russia to a certain extent, but at the same time they want to also create more autonomy within the European Union so that they can take a different path or negotiate a position that meets their local conditions. Central and Slovakia and Czech, they're not really looking at the region broadly, and because they're quite small. And then other countries, whether it's Bulgaria or Romania, are not really thinking about this because they don't know quite how to fit and into the Indo-Pacific region. And I think importantly, they also have relatively good relations with China, and they're getting some infrastructure aid and investment from China, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So I think that economics is driving this. I think that the geographic distance from the region is driving this. But now there's more intellectual understanding that this idea that's been advocated through the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, whether that's the Japanese vision or the American vision or others, preserving the rules-based order and preventing Machiavellian use of power to change how systems work, is gathering momentum in various capitals in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, because they now understand that this concept is so important, and it needs to be realized in their backyard, not just in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, and it strikes me, just as you said, that a lot of the countries there, they actually have good relations with China, and there has been a lot of Chinese investment. So, yes, I believe that they want to be more strategic in this sense of the word, but it's difficult to be strategic when you don't have that much power. I mean, we need to face reality that they're relatively small, and as you mentioned, they are being considered as junior members of the European Union. So. Yes.
That's right. So they are trying to find tools in their diplomatic toolbox to, again, build their economies, to get a stronger position within the EU, and to deal with some of the challenges that are in their backyard. And right now, if you're Polish, it's all about Russia, not about the Indo-Pacific region. But I think that they value the conceptualization of the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, in particular these pillars that focus on transparent, rules-based processes as being the prerequisite for engaging in international affairs.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And Lynn, good evening and welcome.
Yes, hello. Professor Stephen, I watched an interview with France ambassador to the Indo-Pacific, Crystal Panel, and he said that the EU in general and France in particular, they have a three-way approach to China. They consider China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. So in your opinion, is this China approach different from the approach of Japan and many other countries in Southeast Asia? measure that we more know as much as a kind of tactical hedging strategy?
China's approach the same as Japan?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, the three-way approach to China that the France ambassador mentioned, it is different from the approach that Japan and some Southeast Asian countries have with China, as we know as a tactical hedging strategy.
So I didn't see the interview with the French minister, but yesterday I was looking at actually their Indo-Pacific document, and it's changed over the past 4 years. In fact, I first found or learned about their Indo-Pacific document in Yokosuka or Yokota base here in Tokyo at an event that we had talking about EU and U.S. security cooperation. That pamphlet seems to have evolved, and now they put concerns about the regional order changing as being central to how they think about the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, they are also writing about the importance of creating a multilateral order in which not two countries or one country is shaping the regional order, rather several poles. And those poles means that there's more maneuvering room for countries like France to have influence in global affairs. A frank assessment, I don't think we are in a multipolar world whatsoever. The power differentiation between China and the United States and everybody else is huge. And there's no way, for example, a country like Japan or France or Germany can really keep up industrially, economically, diplomatically, and militarily with the two big countries, China and the United States. So they are trying to figure out a way to negotiate a bipolar system or a bipolar order. And this will be increasingly difficult. Now, how does China manage this? China talks a lot about what we call democratizing the international institutions so that they reflect the interests of emerging countries. And I think that this is something that they're continuing would like to do, is strengthen the emerging world and their ability to shape the international system. But again, I think that the Chinese themselves are very much, as one scholar said, they practice foreign policy in a way that we call it Confucian flesh and realist bones. So they pay lip service to, win-win relationships and democratization of the international system. But when push comes to shove, it's all about power and comprehensive power. And that's how they're negotiating the relationships.
Following up my first question, can I ask you another? So Professor Keikoga, in his recent article on East Asia Forum, he said that Japan's foray to date has been quite successful in conducting the two-pronged approach to China. On the one hand, it has enabled Japan to promote the international coalitions that can push back against China. And on the other hand, Japan has also been continuously diplomatically and economically engaged with China. So do you agree with that assessment? And do you think that what can the EU learn from Japan's point?
Well, it's quite interesting to look at this discussion over a longer period of time. And I remember about 10 years ago, before Prime Minister Abe was really pushing the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, the Europeans were kind of laughing. They'd say, oh, the Japanese would come in and they'd talk hard security about China. And, they don't get it, that we just want to trade and we can manage this relationship. But today, I think that they've caught up with where the Japanese were 10 or 5 years ago. And now they're thinking about how China's return to the central position in the region's economic order and some of its recent behavior is affecting their interests. And this is primarily why I think they've adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy. They look at what the Japanese have done and how they framed an Indo-Pacific strategy, focusing on a rules-based order, not necessarily focusing on promoting democracy, but promoting a rules-based order as really critical to bringing stability to the region. So I think the Western Europeans, in particular France, the UK and Germans, perhaps the Dutch, have aligned much closer to Japan's position, and I'll come back to the reason why. But Central and Eastern Europe, the region that we're interested in discussing today, I don't think they're there at all. They don't know how to deal with these concepts because they're not geographically centered in the region. Right now, of course, everything is about Russia. And they frankly don't want to choose between Chinese initiatives and initiatives that are put out by Japan, the United States, and other countries. So they're looking at how they can use all these different tools to support more rapid development and position themselves better within the European Union. So in that sense, they're quite utilitarian in how they're engaging in thinking about the Indo-Pacific and creating their own free, open Indo-Pacific strategies.
I guess so. Thank you, Professor. I have last question.
Okay,
So I
Lynn.
think that yeah, except for the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, I think which is more about security focused, which can easily make the Chinese side interpret that it aims to contain China. However, from the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, and when I look into the content, I think that it is much multidimensional to the point that it not only mentions the defense and security as a pillar of cooperation, but it also mentioned other areas, critical issues like health, climate change, or trade, infrastructure, connectivity. So I just wonder that from the Chinese perspective, do they recognize these kind of cooperation opportunities, or they deliberately ignore these cooperation areas and insisted that it aims to contain China?
Well, I think there's recognition in some circles in the security world in China of the possibility for cooperation, the possibility of these initiatives being used for cooperation. Others look at these initiatives as containment. So there's a mix. And right now, it's the hawkish people that are communicating to Xi Jinping and his gang, and they feel very insecure with, really a growing number of countries losing their or rethinking their relationship with China. Compared to 10 years ago, China at a reputational level is in a much weaker position. And that's not really just in Japan or South Korea or Australia. I think in many countries in Europe, a lot of different aspects of their behavior has been shocking. And even if you go to countries like Hungary, where they have a national interest-based foreign policy, where they tend to not criticize other countries, in private, they're quite, they know what's happening in Xinjiang, they know what's happening in Hong Kong, but they're a small country in the middle of Europe. They have relatively good economic relationships, and they look at it, they say to themselves, why should we say much if we can benefit from this relationship? So it's complicated, and this is what nation states do. They focus on their national interests first, and I think this is why we see countries in Central and Eastern Europe not really want to alienate themselves from China through proactive Indo-Pacific engagement, but at the same time, they're not fools. They understand that it's important to use these initiatives in whatever way they can to benefit and help build their countries.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Lynn.
Chao Ting, hello and thank you for joining us. So I believe that you're still in Germany, or have you moved back to China? Because, I would like to know how you see things, and yes, comment on this topic as well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm still in Germany. Thank you, Maya, and thank you, Stefan. So today's topic is also very interesting. I think the question whether the Indo-Pacific matters to Central and Eastern European countries. My answer is yes. Why? I think Stefan has explained from the rules-based international order perspective. This is right. I think I would like to explain the reason why Indo-Pacific matters to CEE countries from a different perspective. So I think right now the immediate threat for CEE countries is the Russia invasion of Ukraine, right? So I think Russia is the immediate security threat for CEE countries. And from a historical perspective, the Russian Empire has occupied CEE countries, and they have also dominated this region for a very long time. For example, during the Cold War period, the Soviet Empire has dominated the CEE countries. So this is a history. Therefore, Russia is the first focus of CEE countries. There is no any doubt. But this has something with Indo-Pacific. This has something to do with Indo-Pacific. Why? Because if the CEE country want to counter or balance the security threat from Russia, they need outside power. they need America, right? So without the American support, it's really difficult for CEE countries, which are normally quite small, in front of Russia. So they need the American support. But if the American focus on Indo-Pacific, this means the distraction of American attention in the European continent, especially in CEE countries. So in this sense, Indo-Pacific does really matter for the CEE countries. So they hope, they wish American power can stay in European continent to help them to counterbalance the threat of Russia, right? So, but right now, the focus of American seems to be shifting to Indo-Pacific region because China is perceived as the biggest strategic challenge of the U.S. In this sense, I think CEE countries has some concerns about the possible pivot of American power from European continent to Indo-Pacific region. This is first why Indo-Pacific matters to CEE countries. And secondly, I think Indo-Pacific is more and more important for EU and NATO, right? So EU has published its official Indo-Pacific strategy, and NATO is also paying attention to Indo-Pacific region because China is now more and more important. According to the NATO new strategic concept, China is now the systemic challenge of NATO. This means NATO will also pay attention to Indo-Pacific region. Both EU and NATO have realized that the Indo-Pacific region is very important for their future. On the other hand, the CEE countries are also members of EU and NATO. So in this sense, Indo-Pacific matters to CEE countries because they are members of EU and NATO. So this is my understanding. Of course, I think Stephen has also emphasized the importance of rule-based order because most CEE countries are relatively small. So I think they have the reasonable concern about the possibility that the powerful countries will change the rule-based orders through force. So they have also interest in preserving rule-based order in Indo-Pacific region. If powerful countries like China takes over Taiwan through force, this is also a bad example for CEE countries, just as Russia has done in Ukraine, right? So in this case, in this sense, Indo-Pacific matters to CEE countries as well. So this is my understanding about the situation. Thank you.
Yeah, Xiaoting, I think you hit the nail that they're worried about how these a potential something similar happening in their region has happened, or they are looking at how rules are important for protecting themselves against bigger countries, and I think that is really, really important. I think we also need to be thinking about that if the so-called Indo-Pacific focus on a free and open or rules-based order is important, which I do think it is, then why would that region be any different than the European Union? So this is the kind of the broad appeal. If you took away the idea of an Indo-Pacific and you focused on this idea of a rules-based order, it would be much less controversial because everybody, of course, wants. Well, I think most European countries want a rules-based order, and most small countries are comfortable with that kind of concept because they understand that if there's not a rules-based order, this could create real challenges for their sovereignty and their independence. So these are some really, really interesting ways to be thinking about it. Now, is China at the center of this? I don't think. There are concerns about the direction of China and what it's doing, but is it the fundamental driver behind thinking about the Indo-Pacific for Eastern and Central European countries? I would say no. I think that they are seeing it as an opportunity to be more relevant, to be part of the, shaping their own region by using these different agreements or these different framings to shape their backyard. And that makes sense, and I think they're going to continue to see how they can deploy these agreements for their own interests.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I agree. So, Steve, For my observation about the concerns of CE countries, for example, they are worrying about that America will shift its attention from the European continent to Indo-Pacific strategy, to Indo-Pacific region. Actually, this is not only the concern of CE countries, but also generally. So, actually, the entire European continent relies on the security protection of U.S., especially during the Cold War period. And after the end of the Cold War, they have less concern about their security. But now, in the face of Russia invasion of Ukraine, so now they are much more worried about their security. So in this sense, they need American security guarantee. But now it seems that America is mobilizing its forces to Indo-Pacific region because China is the biggest strategic challenger of the U.S. For example, more than 60% of U.S. Navy has been mobilized to Indo-Pacific commando, right? So not only CE countries, but also Germany is concerned about the situation. But I think CE countries has much more concern, much more fear about the possible American power shift because they are under the immediate threat of Russia invasion, especially Poland and Baltic countries, right? So if Putin takes over Ukraine, then Baltic countries can be the next target. So in this sense, I think their security has a connection with the Indo-Pacific region. So what's your evaluation or assessment?
Well, I think that the United States' response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated how important it is in terms of a military power to push back against aggression from countries like Russia. So I think that is, I totally agree with you. There are concerns about how resources may be diverted to the Indo-Pacific, and that could embolden Russia to be more assertive within its backyard. I think that they've also looked at not just the military power of the United States and the ability to provide weapon systems and probably training to the Ukrainians, but importantly, they really, from my standpoint, it was not just the military cooperation that they've provided. I think that they've also provided, that critical diplomatic commitment and those diplomatic tools to bring the Europeans together so that they could cooperate. And I think that is really, really critical, that they provided the backbone to build strong cooperation in terms of financial sanctions, in terms of intelligence, in terms of how they get military goods to the Ukrainians. So I think the role of the United States and its importance and the principles that it stands for have, as you said, Chao-Ting, become more self-evident and more real for those countries that are on the front line of Russia's aggression. And as a result, I think that they see some of the principles like advocating for a rules-based order as being really areas or in the Indo-Pacific. I think also, and this is probably a growing narrative over the past 3 or 4 years, at the end of 2021, the Europeans and China were going to sign the Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and now they're not, right? Now I think it's on the shelf permanently. But they've shifted their positions about the region, Indo-Pacific region, and China in particular, because of a track record of behavior, whether it's the human rights violations of the Uyghur people, whether what's happened in Hong Kong, whether it's the treatment of Australia after it called for an investigation, or what's happened with the Lithuanians. There's this long track record now, and it's confronting European values, and those values are based on a rules-based approach, right? That, giving up this idea of war to solve problems. So I think that there is so many different levels that we can understand this, but one, as you mentioned, is this idea of recognition of the importance of the United States and the kind of world that the role it can have at the diplomatic front, economic front, and military front to create stability and to preserve rules-based order that has frankly brought peace and stability for much of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So, yeah, my observation is that the CE countries normally have different attitudes when it comes to Russia and China. I mean, CE countries have different attitudes and position from Western European countries such as France and Germany. Let's take China as the first example. So China has started and implemented 17 plus 1 with CE countries. So in the past it was 16 plus 1. But later Greece has joined this initiative, so it's 17 plus 1. But now it has become 14 plus 1. Why? Because the 3 Baltic countries have withdraw from 70 plus 1. I mean, the Baltic countries are quite critical of China, and Lithuania has strong connection with Taiwan. So, I mean, the CE countries are normally more aggressive toward China than Germany and France. Why? They are the members of EU and NATO, right? But their position is different from Germany and France. Why? I always ask myself why. I think they need the support of America because they are facing the threat of Russia. They need America more than Germany and France. And China is the biggest strategic rival of America. That's why they are more aggressive toward China because they need the support of America. So this is my observation. So I mean, CE countries have always different positions and attitudes toward Russia and China. So we have to understand why. I think the American factor is playing very important role in if we want to explain the behavior of CE countries. So I mean, the American factor cannot be excluded. I think Poland is another typical example. Poland has a lot of disputes with Germany and France, with Brussels. I mean, with the EU, with EU institutions. I think Poland has a closer relationship with America than Germany and France. CE countries are perceived as new European countries, and France and Germany are perceived as old European countries. I remember this this statement made by the former Secretary of Defense of the U.S. Donald Rumsfeld. I think he called the CE countries as New Europe, France and Germany as Old Europe.
Yeah.
So I think this explains the situation. This explains the situation.
Yeah, there's much to agree with there. In that, I think that especially the Baltic states understand how precarious their situation is, their sovereignty is, and their sovereignty is at the behest of the Russians. Quite frankly, the Russians could go in tomorrow, and that would be it. But that they have to balance how they engage in their relations, and they've been very forward-leaning with the protection of NATO, and of course the United States is part of NATO. But I again go back to the point is that these smaller countries have a vested interest in supporting an order that focuses on rules, not power. And but that being said, they need to back up their aspirational approach with a focus on rules with a friend that is quite big, and that's the United States and NATO. So it's maybe a dual-pronged approach to how they think about a rules-based order. That they're going to support it as much as possible diplomatically, but at the same time they need to be quite practical. That they need to also have strong relations with the United States and keep the United States anchored in the region as much as possible. And one way to do that is to provide some buy-in to the so-called Indo-Pacific vision or some of the concepts, or how they can use these concepts to serve their interests. and to build more diverse relationships. And I think that's what they're doing.
Chao Ting, I hope this responds to your comments. And
Very good.
Sorry,
Yes, thank you.
Professor Stephen, can I ask you a question?
Yes, go on.
Yes, so now I think that we have a lot of discussion about the Indo-Pacific. So that is mean that the discussion of Asia-Pacific, for example, become outdated.
Well, I think that Asia Pacific and Indo Pacific are, they're connected in many ways. We have institutions such as APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Community, that are still intact. But I think there's also at the same time a view that new institutions and new framing needs to be made. Now, there is a point that the Indo-Pacific framing is a geopolitical concept to constrain China, to decenter China from the Asia Pacific. That there might be some truth to that. At the same time, I think there's a view that Asia Pacific was exclusive, that it didn't include India, didn't include South Asia, and that community has become much more significant in the global economy. And the Indo-Pacific framing allows us to include new stakeholders in the most economically dynamic part of the world.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I asked this question because if I change the question of the topic today is does the Indo-Pacific matter to my home country or to Southeast Asia in general? I would say that I think that the answer may be yes, but to be honest, there seems to be not much discussion. If I want to say that no discussion about the Indo-Pacific in my country.
Well, I know behind closed doors that people are talking about it, but I think it's quite utilitarian. Is that how they can? It has come online. It's important, but how can this framing be used? And there's a good report out of the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, and I'll just get the author because I think she's really great. But she highlighted the fact that, for example, Indonesia uses the Indo-Pacific framing differently than, let's say, Vietnam. Vietnam uses the Indo-Pacific framing in a more realist way of how it can use this idea to achieve its geopolitical priorities within the region. And I found that quite interesting, where the Indonesians have used the idea of the Indo-Pacific in a more constructivist way of how they can create shared maritime governance. So, there's a lot of different views, and I'm sure that the Central and Eastern Europeans, and even those Greeks, because I know there's a Greek on the call, are thinking about how they can use these concepts to benefit for their benefit.
Thanks, Stephen. That was a cue.
That was a cue. It sure was, Nikhil.
Yeah, half Greek. Listen, it actually has to do a little bit with Greece. It's actually about Hungary, since we're talking about this Central and Eastern European countries. Now, I have noticed, and I wonder how you see that, or whether you can enlighten us a little bit. There's a couple of exceptions. I mean, what you said about the smaller countries in Central and Eastern Europe in general is all understood, but there's a couple of exceptions. Hungary is one, and I'm going to stretch the term CE a little bit and include Turkey. Turkey is another one. Now, both are allies. They're in NATO, but Hungary is, I think I did know that, is a member of the Organization of Turkic States, which has the secretariat in Istanbul, and I think the institutions in Turkmenistan. And I'm not sure whether Hungary was at the CSO meeting. Turkey certainly was. So there's these two countries, at least one of them is clearly Central European, that sort of dance on a lot of weddings right now. Do you see, is that something that is reversible or strategic, or are they rediscovering their, because both have Central Asian roots, of course, or is that something that goes deeper in terms of their, leaving the line as much as they can of let's say, Western European allied policy? Or am I just scaremongering?
No, I don't think it's scaremongering. I think it's important to recognize that certain countries continue to position themselves in a way that they can ascend within the regional community as an important country without committing into any entangling alliances. Now, India has done this in South Asia. It joins the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but at the same time, it's strengthening its partnership with the Quad and advocates for the Indo-Pacific. I think this region that we're talking about, we've seen countries like Hungary engage with the European Union, but at the same time take a different path and try to form strong relations with other countries like Russia and China. So their view is that the best way to move forward is not really to form strong alliances, but make sure that you're not alienating anybody, because that best positions you to get the kinds of leverage or the kinds of resources that you want. At least that's how I understand it. And I think Central and Eastern European countries are going to continue down that path. One, because I think they feel marginalized within the EU and as second-class European citizens. But two, I think that they understand that this is probably a more effective way at getting more resources in their country than just jumping full in with both feet with the European Union and hoping the European Union is going to come back and provide a lot of aid and development assistance for their economies.
Well, sure, yeah. I guess what I wanted to say, sorry if I add to that question. I mean, I guess for Turkey, it's totally understood. It's a regional power.
Absolutely.
It sees itself as a almost a civilization state. So it has that I understand that and actually they're quite successful. I mean, they're playing the role. Erdogan is playing the role that Macron would have loved to play, right? Be the mediator between Russia and the West, and it's actually Erdogan who is taking over. So I get that, but my question is Hungary, and that's really a question mark for me.
Well, I might have Hungarian roots, but I don't speak for the Hungarian government, but kind of the Hungary and frankly other Eastern Central European countries after the Soviet Union fell, everything was about the West. And, after 30 years, they're still, seen as, they feel like second-class citizens.
There.
And that they feel that, what's happening in Brussels and Paris and London and Berlin is not representative of their historical experience and their societies. And they are trying to negotiate a new position within the European Union as Europeans, but at the same time trying to chart a different path forward. And I think this is why they have slightly different views on everything from how to work with China to thinking about a more national interest-based foreign policy approach to utilitarian approaches to Indo-Pacific visions and the BRI. A very national interest-based approach, again, with this idea of rebuilding their position within the European Union. And I think that's quite fascinating, but I don't think it's uniquely Hungarian.
Well, I'm going to finish with just one historic parallel. Since you mentioned the Greeks, you know that it was a guy called Orban who sold the cannon with which they brought down the walls of Constantinople. That was a Hungarian named Orban. So there's this sensitivity about Hungary moving very close to the Turkish state. So that's where it comes from.
I'm going to have to look into that, and I'll talk to my Hungarian diplomatic friends about how they understand this and get back to you.
Oh, yeah, we remember. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mikio.
Thank you, Mikio and Stephen. And there are several comments in the room chat from Hiroaki. Hiroaki, I invite you to join us here and talk. Well, just be concise and and to the point if you are in a position or in a situation that allows you to talk. Right, and so let me see the first one from Hiroaki. What is the potential impact of European Parliament resolution, the resolution of the 15th of September 2022, on the situation in the Strait of Taiwan to the Central and Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific per se? So this is a long question, but yeah, Stephen.
Thanks, Hiroaki. So I think what's important about this is that it shows that the European Union as a union has come together to take a common position on Taiwan. Now, this is really, really interesting in terms of how it's formulated, because what we see is there's a common position at the European level, but at the country level, it may be not so. The countries, they may not be have the same sentiment. Now, you might be saying, well, how does this work? How do they get away with this? Well, what happens is that they can tell their supporting countries. So let's say Hungary is not happy about this. So what they'll do is they'll say to the Chinese. They'll say, listen, this is part of the European Union. This is what we have to do to maintain our position. We privately feel different. And this is how they manage it. And I think this is an interesting way to do it. But the reality is that it could create challenges for Europe moving forward. And if a country like, let's say, Hungary decides to make a different choice for in the future. But this is, I think it's significant. I think it puts Europe on this, in the same page of the book in terms of how they are thinking about Taiwan, and it's a real important issue. And I think that it comes hand in hand with other incidents, such as the French just sending a bunch of leaders to China or to Taiwan just this week. So it's part of a broader picture where the Europeans are standing up to what they understand as a more assertive China that is really, may try to change the regional order that would have negative repercussions for European countries.
Oh, yes, and following with the other comments there and questions. Yes, okay, yes. What kind of strategy does China have? Sorry, Stephen. I was talking, yes. With my mic muted. Yes, Zhao Ting?
Yeah, excuse me. I have one question to Stephen. Yeah, Stephen, I remember you have recommended one research report written by Polish scholars, Polish experts. So I have read that research report. The title is Beijing-Moscow Axis: The Foundations of an Asymmetric Alliance. Yes. So have you also read that research report?
Yes.
So so I have read this report. According to the authors, the Russia-Chinese alliance is actually very strong, very powerful. It's not an alliance of convenience. Their alliance has solidarity and historical foundation. So, what's your evaluation of this research report? If Russia-Chinese alliance is so strong and powerful, this means they will form an Eurasia continental power bloc. So this is similar to the old Cold War. During the old Cold War, the Soviet Union and China had an alliance, especially from 1950s to 1960s. So they are against the so-called Euro-Atlantic system between America and Western European countries. And today, it's repeating the history. So for CEE countries, if the Russia-Chinese strategic alliance is unavoidable, that means CEE must join NATO and the Indo-Pacific to counterbalance Russia-Chinese strategic alliance. So they have no choice. So they are just one part of Euro-Atlantic system. So I know you are more focusing on the rules-based international order. So I'm trying to analyze the situation from another different perspective, from geopolitical perspective, from a perspective of realpolitik, right? So what's your evaluation of this situation? I think the CE countries must take sides between they are between. So I think they have to take the side of Euro-Atlantic alliance. So this is my understanding. So this can explain why CE countries are more and more critical against Russia and China. So this is my understanding. I'm eager to know your evaluation.
So the paper that you mentioned, in my understanding, that I think the way they wrote it is that at the broader level, shouting that there was alignment, not an alliance, but alignment between the United States and China on wanting to weaken international institutions, weaken institutions like democracy, focuses on human rights, focuses on rule of law. I think this is how I understood it at the macro level. And then there is also tension between the two states on other areas within their relationship. So I think the Russians still have deep concern about their Far East and what will China do there. And on the Chinese side, I think that there's concerns about China or Russia in many ways. So I think that that's how I understood the report. I also understood the report as saying that Putin has basically made the strategic judgment that China's star is rising, and that the best way for them to position themselves would be to form or lean towards the Chinese and support Chinese initiatives, because that will position them better vis-a-vis Europe. The Chinese, on the other hand, I think their position is more complicated. I think they still are not happy with the invasion of Ukraine. It's put them in a very difficult position of contradicting their principles of peaceful coexistence, in particular focus on sovereignty and non-interference. I think that they are looking at the actions, in particular the failure of Russia to succeed quickly, as indicative of Russia's weakness, but also the strength of a united West, and what that means for China if it decides to take a more competitive approach to the so-called West. So these are some of the take-homes I have from that report, and I think the Central Europeans and the Eastern Europeans probably have a similar view that Russia's intentions for their countries haven't changed, and that they will need to find ways to anchor the United States into the region to prevent Russian aggression. And I think it's only reinforced their views rather than soften their views.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a question once again from Hiroaki. Can China agree with CIS, the fundamental rule-based order, at least the 1970 UN Friendly Relation Declaration?
Hiroaki, we don't know, right? We don't know what is the limits of that relationship. And I think that, as I mentioned, at the macro level, there's alignment that they want to weaken the United States position because that makes their regime secure. And they'll do as much as they can to do that. But is there alignment on their rules-based order? I think their idea of a rules-based order is weak United States and a Russia and China that can do what they want when they want in their backyard, and then at the international level or the global level to have less U.S. primacy or less Western primacy in how international institutions are managed.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Stephen. Well, and there are other comments along, once again here in the room chat. So, all right. This is a great opportunity for China if they can make and manage a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. They can lead diplomacy and be a rule shaper, be a great nation. So, Stephen, what is your view on this?
Well, I think that China's position as an important country will probably not be associated with Ukraine and Russia. I think that their reputation as a great country will be likely associated with elevating or bringing 600 million people out of poverty into relative prosperity, rebuilding their country. We don't know how long this will last and what's the sustainability, but I think these are enormous contributions to not only Chinese to the Chinese state, but to humanity. That they've shown how to develop quickly and defeat poverty. But on the Russian front, I think that right now they are seen as a facilitator. They are seen as dishonest, and they are seen as having taken on the Russian propaganda and giving it to their people. For the Ukrainians, they're really going to be an important partner for rebuilding the country once this war is over through probably BRI funding. But I think that their reputation will now be forever tainted with the invasion of Ukraine and facilitating Putin's war.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. And, it looks like we don't have any other raised hands at the moment. And I believe that, we can wrap up the room here and get ready for the next one, which is going to be about who who rules in the Indo-Pacific. And it's going to take place in 2 weeks. That will be October the 3rd. So everybody who is in the room, please join us at that time again. It will be 8 o'clock in the evening Japanese time. So if your schedule allows, please be here with us. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.